Hello, you guys. Topic 3.1 and 3.2 today. Okay, so it'll be pretty straightforward. I mean, some of the things we've already talked about in class, so a lot of it is going to be pretty simple. I think the key for these two topics, and looking at it a little bit more, it's about analyzing visuals, being able to identify the certain cultural traits whenever you see an image, and being able to look at the cultural landscape of any place and being able to determine what society is like there, what gender roles are like there, and all of that. Okay. But again, it doesn't hurt to, to look at all of this again. All right. So, topic 3.1 and 3.2. Okay. So, the enduring understanding for 3.1 is that you'll be able to understand that cultural practices vary across geographic locations because of physical geography and the available resources. Okay. Learning objective for this topic, you'll be able to define the characteristics, attitudes, and traits that influence geographers when they study culture. Okay. And of course, the two big things you'll be able to understand here is culture and cultural traits specifically. Okay, so understand these three here, and you'll be good to go. Okay. So number one here, culture, right? We defined this in class, right? Culture is the beliefs, values, practices, behavior, and technology shared by society and passed down from generation to generation. Okay, cultural traits, those are the specific customs that are part of everyday life of a particular culture, language, religion, ethnicity, social institutions, aspects of cultures, attitudes, right? And culture can kind of be classified into three major types or groups, right? Indigenous, folk or local, modern, and popular culture. And we'll look at some of those. All right. And there are two major components to those three types, right? The material culture, right? The tangible culture, if you remember me saying that, right? The items and objects we give value to, right? Like architecture, clothing, what we use, jewelry, right? What we purchase, right? Phones, I don't know, things like that. Okay. And the non-material culture, right? The ideas, beliefs, and attitudes we hold, right? Whether it's celebrating milestones, like turning 18, right? Whether it's holidays like Christmas or Halloween, right? Differs across places. How do we celebrate our birthdays, right? Life events, right? Um, Celebrating getting married, right? That changes. Okay, so yeah, let's look at it a little bit more, right? And if you can memorize this cultural wheel here, right? What exactly fits into this category of culture, right? You'll be able to understand this unit pretty well. Okay, so I think one of the first things when looking at culture is transportation, right? Understanding how people move across society, right? We might see in big cities technology is greater, right? So like in New York here, right, we'll see people taking the subway, people taking buses, right? Driving nice vehicles, right? If we look here, somewhere like in Africa, in particular, this Nigeria, right? We might see that transportation kind of varies based on Nigeria as a developing society, right? We'll see older cars here, right? We'll see people walking. Okay, architecture is something we could look at. Land use, right? So traditional homes here in China, right? Skyscrapers, big buildings, right, close together, right? I mean, this is close together too, right? But Chicago here, right? Or we could look at land use in rural areas like the terrace farms, if you remember that from used in Southeast Asia. Okay, so thinking about whether a place is rural or urban, right? What's the architecture like? How do they use the land, right? What kind of foods people eat across the world, right? This is pretty generalized, but you can get the idea here. Okay, right? And understanding why it's like that, right? Right? Or even looking, at birth rituals, right? Death rituals, right? So, Tibetan funerals here, we could see that, they kind of do a little bit differently, right, than here in North America or the United States in particular, right? Weddings, right? The style of clothing, how weddings are done, right, varies across places, right? Or education, right? Who's getting educated and when are they getting educated? How many years um, people are getting educated across different countries and different societies, right? Knowing the languages, right, that people speak across the world and how that defines their culture, right? Or even, what kind of music they like, right? Right. This is kind of blurry here, right? But, even understanding, different religions in the world, right? So like, North Africa, the Middle East, Western Asia, it's sort of Islamic, right? India, Hindu, right? Most of the Americas, it's Christianity, but different sects. Okay, right? Or even what kind of things are on display in certain places. Okay, right? How that reflects societal beliefs. So like the United States, right? Abraham Lincoln, right? Or like any other president, right? Idea of freedom, right? Intellect, okay, or the systems in government in place, right? That can say a lot about a country, right? The currency as well, right? Or women's rights, right? And how mobile they can be in a society, right? So I mean, clearly, right, in most of the developed world, right, we could see that women have full freedom, right, to move in public spaces, but also that also is an indication of how much their rights are in society. Okay, so yeah, there's that, and of course, folk and pop culture, right? Being able to, now we're going to break down culture here a little bit more into, different categories, right? So, there's pop culture, modern culture, right? We talked about this. You listen to it, right? Originates in developed countries, diffuses through hierarchical diffusion, right? Heterogeneous groups of people, right? So modern culture is very diverse, changes rapidly, individualistic, happens in urban areas, right? It's all interconnected through globalization, right? So I mean, examples of modern culture, pretty easy, right? Think of Donald's, think of iPhones, think of trends in music or fashion. Okay, folk culture, right? Where the Earth is anonymous, multiple starting points, spreads through relocation diffusion, and unlike pop culture, where it spreads rapidly, folk culture spreads slowly, and it's more reserved for small homogeneous groups of people that are often living in rural areas, isolated, resistance to change, right? So there's a focus on the local community, family, and religion, being important. All right. But that being said, we could kind of break down folk culture a little bit more, right? We kind of break it down into indigenous cultures, right? Indigenous groups of people. Okay. So, I mean, you could look at, Native Americans, here in the Americas or North America, the Zulus in South Africa, the Maasai, I think I said it correctly, in Kenya, okay, or the Tivolis in the Philippines, okay. But no, I mean, when you picture, folk culture, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, you think of people sticking to their roots, right? You think of, the ethnic neighborhoods or enclaves, around major cities, right? Like Chinatown here, um, right? Or you think of the Amish people, right? Rejecting technology, right? Or you think of the way they dress or their way of transportation, right? So again, going back to culture, right? This might help again, seeing the material aspects of culture and the non-material aspects of culture, right? The tangible and the non-tangible. Okay. Okay. So yeah. That being said, you guys, cultural traits. Okay, let's look at this a little bit more. I mean, everything I kind of listed, right, are cultural traits, but I want to, highlight a few other things here as well, right? Cultural traits, right? They include, things like food preferences, architecture, land use. We saw all of that, right? Music, food, clothing, right? Um, these elements they develop through social interaction. Some specifically, I should say, are transmitted or communicated in some form, right? I mean, so think of the languages that you spoke, or the language that you speak, right, or the languages that you speak, right? Think about how you learned it as a toddler, right? As a child, you heard, you listened, you practiced, right? So elements they develop. Culture changes as well, right? Think of the civil rights movement and women's rights in the 1960s, how that all kind of sprung forward in the decade. And since then, right, we've seen the positive, impacts of that. Okay. And, cultural traits, they vary across regions too, right? I mean, we saw in class, right? I showed you how people greet each other, right? Food, okay, so here's an example of food varying across regions in the world, right? So tortillas in Mexico versus that in Spain, right? In Spain, it's a little bit thicker. Um, Personally, I've never tried one. Curious how it tastes. Okay. Likewise, culture evolves from place to place and over time, right? I mean, so think of languages, how that's been in contact, in the past, couple of decades from the United States to Mexico. Think of Spanglish, right? Think of how some words in Spanish have kind of changed, right? As English and Spanish have mixed together, the cultures have mixed together. Okay, if you speak Spanish, right? I mean, see some of these are kind of funny, but if you speak Spanish, you'll understand. Okay, clothing, fashion, beauty that changes across regions, right? What defines beauty in the world, or how people define beauty in the world, right? Clothing changes in different climate zones. So think of what you would wear in, near the equator, right? Mexico versus, in Canada, right? Or Iceland. Or people how they move around, transportation, right? So like in Iceland, I mean, people, I mean, obviously wouldn't drive as many cars, right, as in, North America, trains, right? Religion that defines clothing. So think of the religion in society. Think of the Middle East, right? Jewelry, art, dance, music. That all changes across regions, right? Food as well. I mean, I showed you this in class. I mean, food as well. Think about the religion in the area. Think of what's allowed in Islamic culture, right? Think about kosher foods, what's allowed in for Jewish people, right? Architecture. This is something else that changes as well, right? From what looks good, right? What defines what's good architecture in society changes across regions, right? It's based on religion, right? The materials available, right? And the topography, right? The elevation. Okay. So some societies might like stick with folk culture, right? So I mean, they're gonna continue to build things out of the material that's there locally, while others, follow suit with, pop culture, right? Urban culture, modern culture, right? So, suburbs, the rural areas, right? Or some, in East Asia, right? Southeast Asia. So, you've got these Buddhist temples here, right? In the high elevation. Okay. So, going back to folk and pop culture here, right? So, folk housing, it's what I was saying earlier, right? Environmental influences, right? Choice of building materials, local climate consideration, right? Beliefs about, the shape and orientation of a house. So you got plenty of examples here to look at, right? So yeah, when we talk about culture, when we look at these cultural traits, right, it's important to know, a little bit about yourself, right, before you actually jump into this, right? And people define themselves in various ways, but if we're looking at cultural aspects, right, I think the big four, is gender, race, religion, nationality, right? These are the things that we think of, when we try to define ourselves as people. I mean, we might think of music, right, too, or food and things like that, right? But generally speaking, these are the four that we would consider, right? So, I mean, think about it yourself, right? How do you define yourself? Okay, because defining yourself is pretty important when it comes to, looking at other cultures, right? Because depending on how well you know yourself, right, you might take one of these two views, right? When viewing culture, right, you might take the route of cultural relativism, right? The idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practice should be understood based on that person's own culture, right? So understanding a culture, right, because you want to, right, because you want to see it from that society's point of view, right? So you're being non-judgmental, you're celebrating diversity, you're humanizing other cultures, okay? So you're not comparing it, you're just seeing it for what it is, right? Or you might take the ethnocentric view, right? Ethnocentrism, right? Evaluating other cultures according to preconceptions, based on your standards, your customs, right? So comparing cultures, right? And specifically comparing your culture to another culture, trying to, in a sense, right, prove that your culture is better, right? So cultural superiority, okay? Now, obviously, right, ethnocentrism, right, is, the way I described this is bad, and I think it is bad, right? You want to be able to look at other cultures um, objectively without bias, right? But even then, there are still some limitations with cultural relativism, right? One potential danger of this view here, cultural relativism, is not seeing certain practices, right, like human rights violations, as morally wrong. Okay, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that all differences in human behavior can be attributed to cultural differences, right? Some of it's common sense. Okay, yeah. So I mean, celebrations of native culture, right? Cultural relativism, right there. Okay, but ethnocentrism, right, to kind of highlight it and kind of force yourself to see, what that might look like, right? I mean, you've got this example here of this cartoon, right? So you've got the lady on the left saying everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture, right? And on the right side, you've got the same thing. All right. So what's the ethnocentric thing here, right? It's the fact that maybe in the Western world, women might see the hijab as a sign of submission, right? Head covering, but maybe it's taking the cultural relativistic view, right? It's the fact, if you have that view, you're simply viewing hijab as a way for women to practice their faith, and not comparing, you know, the Western world, right, and saying it's better because it's not male dominated. Okay, or think of your personal reaction, to deep fried insect foods, right, or eating eel, right, for breakfast. Okay, um, your reaction, might be like, it's disgusting, right? And while it's perfectly valid, to say like, yeah, eating insects is not my thing, right? It's another thing to be like, wow, they eat that for breakfast, like eels for breakfast. Really, we eat cereal, right? So I mean, saying that, right? That's ethnocentric, right there. Okay. But if you wanted to fix that, right? I mean, understand why maybe that's eaten for breakfast, right? It's because most countries in Southeast Asia have access to the sea, so fish is a staple of people's diets. A person from Southeast Asia with an ethnocentric view of the American diet might think that eating so much sugar at breakfast and high calorie foods, has minimal nutritional value, very disgusting or repulsive. So, a lot of ways to think about it. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of topic 3.1 there. Cultural relativism, ethnocentrism, cultural traits, and that culture in general. Okay. So here we are, topic 3.2 now, cultural landscape. Okay. So this is kind of the key topic, right? That kind of sets up the rest of the unit. Okay. Enduring understanding is pretty much the same from the last topic. All right. Learning objective is a little bit different. Okay, and it's pretty simple. Describe the characteristics of cultural landscapes. Right? Actually, it's easier said than done. Okay. So, I mean, when you think of the cultural landscape, you guys, I mean, just think of the built environment, right? What humans have kind of constructed, over time, right? The tangible and the non-tangible. Okay, so cultural areas can be several regions. But there are a few traits kind of link all these regions together into a cultural realm, right? There are things that we can see, right, to determine a place easily, right? Food preferences, languages, the language families, right? Religious traditions, shared histories, right? And each of these realms create different cultural landscapes, right? The way the land is used is different in each of these areas, right? The realms do not all use the same agricultural practices, religion, language, and other of those material and non-material things. Okay, but more importantly, cultural landscapes are landscapes that have been affected, influenced, or shaped by human involvement. Okay, and cultural landscapes can be associated with a person, an event, right? They can be works of art, narratives of culture, expressions of regional identity, right? How women are in a society, right? Their role in society, or maybe lack of role. Okay, so here's the big thing to know, you guys. All right, cultural landscapes, combination of cultural, economic, and natural elements. Right. So when you look at a picture, right, of a place, of the cultural landscape, right. So I mean, just think of a picture of Portland, Oregon, right. Look at the physical features, right, the vegetation, the mountain, maybe the climate. Look at maybe the agricultural industrial practices if that's there, right? Fields, maybe they're a field of a certain crop. Maybe you can tell that it's an industry or service economy, right? Look at their religious and linguistic characteristics. Maybe it's languages on a sign, a place of worship, religious dress, religious holidays. Maybe not in Portland, right? Evidence of sequence occupancy, right? And sequence occupancy being being able to tell that you know the mark that, you know, a past society or group has left in history, right? Think of, you know, the architecture. Is it traditional? Is it postmodern? You know, is it modern, right? Because they can reflect power and development of indigenous groups. Think of the land use patterns. What is the land in the area devoted to? Transportation, residency, economy, agriculture. Okay, so these are the kind of the things that you should be thinking about, right? When you see an image, right? Whether it's, you know, subconscious or consciously, all right? But you better train yourself, you know, to see it consciously, right? Rather than subconsciously. Okay. So yeah, land use, right? I mean, is it, you know, in line with modern culture, right? So you've got the suburban, urban areas here, right? Organized, right? So, or is it more rural and folk, you know, where it's more distributed, right? People are, their modes of transportation are a little bit more common, or not common, but, you know, traditional, right? So, you know, you've got a horse and, you know, wagon there. Okay. Sequence occupancy here, right? Looking at the past, you know, being able to see how that's kind of influenced, you know, society there, right? So the ruins in Jordan, right? The ruins in Greece, the European colonial architecture in India. Okay. So, I mean, sequence occupancy is pretty easy. Again, it's groups throughout history that have left their mark. All right. So, you know, think of the Colosseum in Rome, right? That's pretty easy. Okay. Languages here, okay? So, you know, religious and linguistic characteristics, all right? So you can be able to tell, you know, what a place is like maybe just by looking, you know, at the language in the area, right? And sometimes, you know, you'll have, you know, those big signs in different languages, right? I mean, stop signs, right? Big indicator too, okay? Right? Or, you know, the architecture again, right? So if we go back here, right, asking yourself, is it, you know, do you see traditional or modern architecture, right? So here you'll see a traditional Batak house in Indonesia, right? You'll see stone and clay houses in rural Nepal here, right? Or an English vernacular building in the 16th century, right? Half timbering, right? Or, you know, knowing the style, right? That's there, right? It's important to know the different, you know, styles of architecture, right? I mean, I'm not talking about whether it's, you know, a traditional or modern, right? I'm talking about, you know, specific influence, right? Like the Spanish influence here or the French influence here, right? So you've got modern culture here, or sorry, not modern culture, modern architecture, right? Obviously skyscrapers, right? Or you might see, the postmodern architecture where it looks all funky, right? Like this Danzig house here in Prague. Okay, right. Looking at the religious landscape as well, right? So I mean, familiarize yourself with these symbols here, right? Know the different major religions in the world, specifically Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, right? Because you can tell a lot through religious architecture, sacred spaces, right? Toponyms and religious symbols, right? You'll be able to tell what a place is like, if you can see and tell, that there's, Christian church or Christian architecture somewhere, right? Because you'll see the crosses here. So I mean, that's usually the biggest sign, right? Or you might see, architecture that's related to Islam, okay? And I mean, you might be able to tell the pattern here, right? See this, dome, like domes in the middle there, kind of dominating the whole the whole infrastructure. Okay, we call them mosques, right? So usually, you'll see mosque at the center of town, right? Domes surrounded by a few minarets. Um, so yeah, some characteristics there for you to tell. Okay, right? Or you'll see, Hindu architecture. Okay, right? Temples, Hindu temples, right? Elaborately carved exteriors, shrines and temples in India. The sacred site, Ganges rivers, right? The shrines and temples are near rivers and streams. Okay, so I mean, it's pretty easy to tell, what they look like, right? So again, characteristics for you. okay? Or maybe Buddhist temples, right? Being able to tell what these look like and what they are, okay? And of course, you've got Jewish architecture as well, right? Usually they'll have the Star of David there, right? Synagogues is what they're called. I just forgot it there. Okay, so yeah, so this map, of course, that you see here, right? It's just important to know again, right? The different regions of the world. Okay, as always, familiarize yourself with the regions of the world, right? Because I think at this point, with the map quizzes that we've done, um, you're able to tell, right, what the what they look like, or not what they look like, right? What they are, the regions in the world. Okay, so I'm not going to read all this, but it's just again everything I stated regarding the cultural landscape. Okay, so take a look. You don't have to read it, but you can if you want. All right, something I didn't mention actually was cemeteries, right? They show a lot about cultural history, right? So I mean, you might find some, no cemeteries at all in one place. Maybe because cremation is a big deal in that culture. For example, Hindu culture, right? Cremation is huge. Okay, but anyways, some other examples, for you to look at, regarding cultural landscapes here. Okay. Okay, awesome. So something else that's important about knowing cultural landscapes is the fact that if we look closely, right, at the cultural landscape of a society, right, we can tell a lot about a society's attitudes towards ethnicity and gender, right, including the role of women in the workforce, ethnic neighborhoods, and indigenous communities and lands help shape the use of a space in a given society. Okay, so the cultural landscape can give us clues as to the ethnic composition of a community, past or present. Right? You can look at restaurants, toponyms, architecture, and language. Okay, um, so I mean specifically, we're going to be looking at ethnic enclaves here, right? Ethnic neighborhoods, right? The city can have a large impact on cultural landscape and the use of space in a given society, right? Clusters of people in the same culture, but surrounded by people of a culture that is dominant in the region. Okay, so these ethnic enclaves, these ethnic neighborhoods, they often contain houses, stores, religious institutions, signs, and traditional language. So here, you'll see, I believe it's Mandarin, right? An architecture that reflects the place of origin. All right, there may be dominant culture's desire to segregate a minority culture, right? So it's also a possible buffer against discrimination by minority culture. So, in other words, these are neighborhoods where ethnicity tend to gather together, right? So, I mean, there's a Chinatown in Portland, and you'll be able to tell, right, that it's obviously Chinatown, right? Just based again on the houses there, the stores there, the religious institutions, right, the signs and languages, right, the architecture. Okay. So yeah, you'll see other names like Little India, Koreatown, right, or Little Italy, right. So this is New York City by ethnicity here, and you can tell right where these ethnic enclaves might be. Okay, gender again is something, or not again, right? But gender is something else, that we can tell by looking at the cultural landscape, right? And specifically, gendered spaces. Can exist in homes, in workplaces, in public areas. When you think of gender roles, you might think of locker rooms separating men and women. I mean, that's a pretty basic example of gendered spaces, right? But a bigger, I think, example, a better example would be economic roles maybe in the society, that kind of separate men and women, right? So maybe in some societies, women, their role is, to be in the kitchen, right? That infamous example there, women being in the kitchen, or maybe the fact that, women are more common as teachers, right, than men. Okay. So gender and gender roles is heavily impacted by ethnicity and culture. Right? Traditional roles vary from culture to culture. In most traditional cultures, women are responsible for the house and children, and men are the money earners, right? But obviously, as you guys know, this changes as society develops, that through DTM and women join the workforce. Okay. And I make or gendered spaces here sound bad, right? But in some cases, they can be supportive, but um, usually, right, we kind of picture it as restricted. Okay. So some examples here for you to look at, looking at the cultural landscape, right, and understanding gender roles, right? You might see, you know, here in Peru, right, traditional Andean clothing usually done by women, right? Or here you might see in some African societies, right, women carrying water home. Okay. And lastly, here, indigenous people in the indigenous community, right? They're very visible in the landscape, right? Because they're so distinct and different from the normal cultural landscape around them. It's again the indigenous community, the community of indigenous people living together, working to keep their culture alive, right? Because let's face it, right? Modern culture has kind of, globalization in general, right, has kind of killed off a lot of the uniqueness of certain places, for better or worse. So yeah, right. I mean, there are plenty of areas in the world that are specific areas in the world that are attempting to, maintain their culture and keep the indigenous community alive. Right, but obviously, as some of you know, maybe with U.S. history, right, there's been a pretty dark past, chain of events and destroying, the way of life for certain indigenous people and quite honestly, right, the first Americans here, the original Americans. Okay, so yeah, guys, when you analyze, so let me backtrack a little bit here, right? So the cultural landscape, right? I'm showing you all of this, right? Not because I'm telling you, right, like learn the architecture of religious um, you know institutions, right, or know the difference between modern cultural land use and folk land use, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to do here, right, is hold on a second, right, is to be able to analyze images, right, and tell, right, where is this, right, what can we tell about society, right, what can we tell about the cultural, or what can we gain from the cultural landscape, okay, of a place. Okay, so whenever you analyze images, right, whenever you analyze photographs, right, focus on the spatial patterns, right, whether it's the number of people there, right, the clothes they're wearing, right, what can you tell about gender roles there, right, based on clothes and the other things we're going to list, right, what can you tell from the architecture, maybe can you see the language there, right, can you tell what the religion maybe is, right, is it urban or rural, right, what are the land use patterns, what are the physical features there, what's the climate like, can you tell what the transportation is there, right, communication, right, is it a developed or developing area, right, what are people using in that area, right, can you tell they're using phones, can you tell they're wearing coats, shorts, right, what are they using, okay. So I mean, maybe some of you can tell, right from the get-go, right, where is this place, right. I mean, obviously, you can tell there's a lot of people here, right? You can see a mix, of men and women, right? You kind of see that, it's like you got a lot of light here, right? Right, you got some. It looks like it's a city because you got high rise, not very high, right? But you've got some more than two-story buildings here. Let's see, what else have you got here? Right, you've got what looks to be an Asian language, right? I'm just gonna tell you right now, right? It's Tokyo. Okay. Right, so we've got the Japanese language here. Right. Or, where is this? Right. What can we tell from here? Right. Obviously it doesn't look like an urban area, right? It's day. We see, men here wearing shorts. We see they're wearing what looks to be, pretty regular, clothing. Right. I mean, we see this lady here, and it looks to be like she's wearing some traditional clothing, right? Obviously, she's got something on her head there, so perhaps you know, we can tell here that maybe women have a pretty strict role in society here, maybe an unwritten, right? I mean, if we look at the architecture here, right, it seems to be like, you know, it's made from what's readily available in the area, right? This is actually Indonesia, by the way. Right? I mean, we can see this moped here. So clearly, you know, people can't necessarily afford cars, nice cars, right? I mean, it doesn't look very nice to me. Obviously, a street market, right? So again, looking at all of these things here, right? Or how about this here, right? What can we tell from this, right? Obviously, you know, the person who took this picture is on a what looks to be a river, right? A boat, right? I don't know about you, but you know, I can tell there are a lot of people here in this area here, right? It looks to be like maybe it's an urban area, right? Because we kind of see some of the buildings, kind of, you know, multiple stories here, right? In the back here, maybe we can tell, is that a mountain? Perhaps, right? You can see some temples here. It's pretty hard to tell, right? But those are temples, right? This is actually the Ganges River, right, in India. Right? So you can see some Hindu influence here, right? This is pretty blurry, but it is actually darn, I forgot the name of it, right? But it's basically a market, right, on a canal, right, where people are in boats. It's in Vietnam. Darn, I wish it was. I didn't realize how blurry it was going to be. Okay, right. I mean, but you know, we can tell, right? People, you know, it looks to be a mix of men and women. I mean, it's pretty blurry. Tell they're wearing traditional clothing. Nothing in particular here. Right. Obviously, if they're selling things on the river or on the canal here, right? Um, you know, Southeast Asia, East Asia, right? Take a lot of their food from nearby rivers and oceans, right? A lot of fish in the diet. Okay, this is better here, right? Where could this be, right? I mean, we can't see there's people. We see a mix of languages, right? I mean, we see English here. We see Chinese. Right? We see here it says no parking, right? I mean, we do still see some traditional, you know, architecture, some folk architecture, right? But at the same time, we see modern culture here, right? We see Chase Bank here. Okay. I mean, let's look back here, right? Physical features, right? Looks to be like it's a hill, right? I mean, this seems to be going upwards, right? In the back here, we can kind of see that maybe it's an urban area because that looks like a city there, right? It's definitely a developed area, right? This would actually be Chinatown, right, in San Francisco. Pretty hard to tell, right? But you know, obviously, if you know anything about San Francisco, right, you know that's a very it's almost like a hill, right? Okay. But anyways, yeah. So yeah, cultural landscapes, you guys. 3.2. Okay. You know, it's going to take a lot of getting used to looking at some images and being able to tell, um, what society is like there, what gender roles are like there, right? What the culture is like there. But it's an important skill, and you know, I honestly think, you know, if you can break it down, you know, looking at, you know, these elements, right, you'll have a good chance of being able to, you know, interpret, right, what culture may be like there, right? I mean, obviously, you know, it's totally different being there rather than, you know, as opposed to, you know, looking at when compared, you know, to looking at a photo. Yeah, one skill to know. Anyways, if you guys have questions, let me know. 3.1, 3.2, your assignment is going to be photographic analysis. Okay, so good luck with that. All right, but as always, let me know if you have questions.